One of the more spectacular ERP implementation failures involves Metcash and its $300 million Microsoft Dynamics disaster. What happened and what can you learn about it? That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. For the past 20 years, I've drafted and negotiated a variety of technology-related contracts and litigated failed software implementation projects in courts across the country. Metcash is an Australian-based retailer with a diversified organization, and they sell liquor, hardware, and groceries. And one of its goals in implementing Microsoft was to really unify its diverse business models under the Microsoft system. And I think where this all went wrong really, is kind of a common list of the usual suspects here. But Metcash really expected a straightforward plug-and-play D365 solution, and it really failed to grasp the realities of how difficult and challenging an ERP implementation would actually be. And I think anytime you've got disparate systems and diversification, if you've got different goods that you're selling, like groceries, hardware, liquor, while that may not seem complicated, I think it adds another layer of complexity into the implementation that certainly Metcash was not ready for. And again, they really underestimated the complexity of the process. The diverse nature of Metcash's grocery, liquor, and hardware business made standardizing processes much harder than was anticipated. Metcash attempted to unify vastly different business models with respect to food, liquor, and hardware into a single operating model, but it really failed to account for the unique nuances and business processes associated with each one of those lines of business. The project was plagued with timeline issues and budget overruns. It went significantly over its initial budget, which was estimated at $80 million USD, and missed its 2023 go live, which cost it hundreds of millions more. It took much longer than anticipated to actually go live on the software and to get it right-sided. They'd initially budgeted $80 million, and the costs surged to approximately $300 million, which I think is a really shocking statistic. You're expecting to pay 80, and you end up paying almost $300 million for the implementation. That's hardly a success story. So how did they get into that situation? And I think you look at the public reports, the media around this, and really it looked like there was really an over-reliance on consultants and really a lack of ownership of the project. The criticisms of this have been that the company became too dependent on external consultants. They did not have a strong internal leadership team, and they didn't really take ownership of the project's success. And I think that's a risk that we see happen a lot in the disputes that we deal with, and a lot of times that's perpetuated by the actual service provider, and they say, don't worry about it, we'll run the show for you. And in fact, a lot of times they want it that way. They want you out of the mix so that they can run the show and they can be free to bill the way they want to bill. And I think it makes it easier for them. But that's really the fox watching the hen house, and I think that is a recipe for a disaster. There was internal bias. They had previously implemented D365 in a small portion of their business. It had been successful, so they did not do the necessary due diligence associated with a software selection that maybe they should have done. They relied on their past experience, which was limited. This internal bias really contributed to failure. The overutilization of consultants and the over-reliance on consultants we just talked about, but the numbers are actually striking. They had over 200 consultants from both KPMG and PwC, which is just amazing. I mean, the cost overruns associated with that, letting them dictate how the project is going to be run with very little oversight and ownership. I mean, that is a massive recipe for disaster right there. Shocking to say, there was poor project management. They were skipping phases. They were not sufficiently testing the software. There were poor integration practices, and all of these were contributing factors to the failure of the implementation. There were also governance and leadership issues. There was no real high level support for the project. There wasn't really an executive sponsor that was involved in the way that they should have been. And so again, all of these are contributing factors to the failure of the software project. So what are the key takeaways? Well, I think there are a few. What can you learn from this? And I think vendor lock-in and vendor bias is really problematic. You don't want to assume that a single vendor like Microsoft D365 in this case is going to fit all your needs. I mean, if you only utilize that particular vendor in one small area of your company, maybe it was good for that. But if you're going to take it into a much more complicated scenario and try to get organized with all these various business units, maybe that software is not fit for that, and maybe you should do the due diligence to understand where the functionality gaps are. I think you want to have a standardized process. You want to understand the diverse business processes, certainly before the implementation. You don't want to force a system into one system on varied operations, right? You've got to account for the differences in those, and trying to streamline them into one process just is not viable sometimes. And I think you've got to account for the complexity associated with doing that, and really figure that out before you've started implementing the software. And then again, you've got to have realistic expectations about what it takes to implement software. You can't over-rely on vendor representations. You can't believe what the salespeople are telling you about the complexity of the implementation, and it's fit for your business. I mean, those are things that really are on you, that you've got to put the due diligence in and really get an understanding of how that software is going to work, what the functionality gaps are, what is it going to take to get you over the finish line. And then once you understand that, I think that's part of the first process of setting yourself up for success. So I think there are some pretty key lessons learned from this. And you don't want to be like Metcash, right? You want to do your own due diligence. You want to set yourself up for a successful implementation. If you have any questions about any of the issues in this video or any of our other videos, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you and get you pointed in the right direction.